Now, I guess one of the things that is really key in this text is it is about asking better questions, and questions themselves are really at the centre of every act of teaching that we do, from being in grade school right through to being PhD student, a grad student. All of that work that we do in teaching and learning is centred around questions. And so the inspiration for the book is this is a really neglected practice often in teacher education, and often something that we take for granted, but it's something which is really central to our practice as educators. This is the third edition, and so the original edition was done completely by Joanne Saxton and Nora Morgan, and when they started, they realised that there was a really big gap in this area. And in this new edition of the book, we've completely rewritten it. So there's been Juliana Saxton, the original author, Carol Miller, who's a long-term colleague of Juliana's, and Linda Laidlaw, who's at the University of Alberta, and myself, Joanne O'Mara from Deakin University in Australia, as you can hear from my accent. And one of the things that was really surprising to us when we started this revision is we did a really big annotated literature review, and we realised that the central ideas in the book had not really been pursued over the time. And so we realised that there was still this huge need for the book. And so we updated it through our research processes and drawing on, contemporary ideas. But that's still that same idea about how do you ask a better question? How do you embed good questioning practices in your teaching and learning was so important to us in everything we developed. And also, we believe something that's really key for teachers and of great value to pre-service teachers. There's a whole focus on inquiry-based learning, where students have the agency to ask their own questions and to develop their own ways of engaging with the world through their questioning practices. And in that section, we look at how can I, as a teacher, support my students to ask better questions, and what are ways that we can do that. So the book models all different approaches and ways that we might think about questioning, and different ways that we might think about the development of the questions themselves, but then how I, as a teacher, enact those questioning practices. Often when you ask a question, you start to feel anxious if nobody answers it straight away. And so one of the things we've looked at are studies that show that most people only wait like a really short amount of time. And if nobody answers, they'll immediately either call upon someone or answer the question themselves because of that space, that silence in between the moment of the question and the wait for the answer. And so we talk about, practices of waiting, ways that you can have students prepared so that they're ready to answer the question, but also that, the time itself between the question emerging and the answer returning is actually active time. It's time when people are thinking. It's time when people are, bringing together their answer. And it may be a time that you are getting students to dialogue with each other and then come back with a range of different answers. So that's kind of the sort of practices that we're encouraging, different ways of people thinking about, how can questions become active and an active part of your teaching practice, and then how might you facilitate different students and different processes in your classroom to make the classroom more enlivened and engaging. I think these different ways of giving agency to your students through the questions that you ask is a really important one. And it's one which I know, because I work in pre-service teacher education in Australia, and it's one which all of us can find quite difficult, and especially when you start, because often when you begin to teach, you feel anxious about what's going to happen in the classroom, and you feel like everything's out of control and I can't get a handle on top of it. And so often these practices of enabling your students to develop their own question and enabling them to follow their own lines of inquiry can be more difficult when you begin teaching, because you have to let everything unravel by itself rather than you being in control. And so my advice to you would be to have a look through sections of the book and think about, how those practices might apply to the particular situation you're in, and then think about, what is it that I could adapt from here? Because always when we're teaching, we're taking an idea or a piece of theory and we're turning it into practice for that moment with those kids on that day. So it's not even just, for kids in, the Finch area of Toronto, or kids who are living in Queens. It's for kids that are in that school at that moment in time. And so, these weeks while we've been all in lockdown here and, you've got your borders closed, a lot of schools are moving to virtual teaching and learning here, which is like a really big new thing. And so there's, a feeling of uncertainty. And so how you might deal with opening up questions now has to take that into consideration. So when I ran my tutorial online the other day, I began with some really closed and focused activities so people were feeling safe before I opened it out. Whereas maybe at another time of the year, I might begin with something which is quite open and let people run off where they are. So sometimes those constraints are emotional constraints you have as a teacher because of where your students are at. And sometimes they're about the newness of the topic, or they might be about, where the work needs to go. And we've got a section which is around following lines of questioning around refugees across the world and thinking about things like climate catastrophe. And so some of those themes which I think are really present in this period of time, which is called the Anthropocene, are quite present in the inquiries in the book. So it provides sort of places where teachers might start to build their own units of inquiry along some of those themes, which I think are coming more and more into schools. And I guess the last thing that I would say is that, for me personally, the greatest joy about the book was being able to revise it with my 3 colleagues. Juliana Saxton, who's the most wonderful drama professor who has just been an intellectual inspiration to me. Carol Miller, who's the most incredible teacher I've ever seen, especially working with young people. And she's just such a gift to the world of Canadian education. And Linda Laidlaw, who's been a long-term colleague, and she and I have worked together very closely after the last 20 years. So for me, the connection with Canada, with those 3 women, has been really important to my life and my intellectual development. So that personally has been, for me, the greatest joy about the book.